Hey guys, Level Cap here. CitizenCon 2024 just wrapped up, which is the yearly massive convention for Star Citizen. Chris Roberts was there, many developers were there, showcasing panels over 2 days comprising of about 14 hours-ish of live streaming information and content. I'm going to break all of that info down for you as quickly and succinctly as possible. There was a lot of really important stuff. In fact, I would argue some of the most important information we've ever received about the game, plus an incredible gameplay showcase of the prologue for Squadron 42. Let's dive into it. Starting off the convention in usual form, we had Lando to warm up the crowd. Then, of course, Chris came on stage to do the thank yous and stats and talk about how great the community was. And then we got into Brave New Worlds, showing off what they're calling Genesis, which is basically a data-driven system for creating massive procedural worlds at a fidelity level that's frankly never been seen before. They began by showing density updates for grass, rocks, trees, being able to render more of them and make the environment look more realistic. This was all data-driven and based on biome stuff. They also talked about increasing biome variation, not just across the planets, but in smaller chunks so that when you're exploring around, you're not just only going to see trees, but you will see that morph into different styles of biomes in smaller areas. A big portion of the presentation was talking about foliage growth, scaling plants and trees up, making them look more realistic, and using terrain and planetary data to create much more accurate placements where things should exist, creating just a much more realistic looking and laid out planetary system. They talked about pushing a lot more of this tech onto the GPU instead of the CPU for faster propagation of assets on the client side. At a glance, it wasn't immediately clear how much stuff had changed, but when they started doing the comparison shots, the difference was massive. That said, I did notice a little bit of floating rocks and tree popping still shown in some of the videos, so it's not perfect, but it is a huge improvement. They then moved on to show new biomes, like the swamp, which featured more interactive water with players moving through that water and even pushing floating logs out of the way. They then showed off jungles with insanely dense foliage and plant propagation happening even on tree trunks and tree branches. Then they showed off redwoods, which I think was one of my favorites, featuring massive sequoia trees, ferns, and a nod to the Star Wars speeder chase scene, which, I mean, it just looked fantastic. There is more foliage interaction, which means pushing plants aside as you walk through them, and I would imagine this also means for downwash from aircraft and stuff like that. They then moved on to show how this same system was going to integrate with propagating hundreds and thousands of outposts around planets in a procedural manner, but with no repetition and highly logical layouts that respected proximity to one another and even the planet and terrain design on where people would put outposts in relation to other things. The design of the system propagates more than just outposts, but shipwrecks and points of interest every or at least every 100 kilometers, which might not sound that dense, but when you're exploring a massive planet like this going at pretty fast speeds, that means you'll come across something fairly interesting. And I would hope once scanning is integrated to this, it means you can stay on a planet's surface just exploring and finding new points of interest somewhat indefinitely, which was a point that they made during the presentation, was to let you just hang out on a planet and not really be forced to constantly jump back up into orbit. You can just explore to your heart's content and find meaningful content. They then talked about some of the faction ownership of the different clustering on these planets, where you might find a large faction has massive clusters of outposts that are all centralized around huge distribution centers, and these could make up literally hundreds of different outposts all interconnected to each other with logical placements and separation of mining facilities to farming facilities to bunkers to distribution centers, expanding thousands and thousands of kilometers. And then outside of that cluster, there might be another cluster with a completely different faction and style and personality based around what they're doing. The presentation then further evolved into how AI were going to integrate with this and respect the environment. So the day-night cycle would greatly affect what you see in an outpost. For example, there might be less patrols active at night and you will get better visual concealment, but the AI might also integrate the use of copians to help them better detect targets at night. So the threats you face at night versus day will change. They also showcased some of their upgraded nav mesh tech, which allows AI to navigate the surface of a planet. They showed off real-time updates based on vehicles dropping in somewhere, creating new areas of cover and new obstacles to avoid. It was pretty darn impressive. It is tech that we would see in other engines, but doing it on a planet-side scale is really insane. It also incorporated new Maelstrom destruction systems. For example, barrier walls that can be destroyed mid-combat will now reduce the amount of cover available, and the AI will react to that, taking cover behind walls that have not been destroyed. And of course, in addition to plants respecting the terrain data and what will propagate where, the creatures are also integrated to this calculation, so different creatures will appear in different biomes. Now, the last phase of this presentation focused on some major visual upgrades, specifically around global illumination, which looks massively improved from the last time they teased it. The interior rendering and shadows looked infinitely better, so much more realistic and basically on par with any modern game engine, just again done on a global scale. The fog rendering and light scattering looked incredible as well, and I can't wait to explore a foggy landscape with this new tech. They also then dove into audio improvements and how the audio engine was basically going to be dynamic, where it could integrate things like the Doppler effect, where sounds sound different as you approach them versus move away from them. They would also have dynamic sound speed for all the effects in the game so that you would hear delays at distance, and it would encounter atmospheric density to change the audio properties. This is pretty darn impressive tech. We are seeing this in other modern game engines, but again, what made it so impressive was just the scale at which Star Citizen works at. They then moved on to cloud tech, leading to natural weather fronts. So sunny days turning into cloudy days, turning into rainstorms, which of course includes dynamic lightning, which can hurt you. This ended the demo on a very impressive presentation tying all of these elements together. A player exploring a lushly propagated landscape at night with a weather front and rain coming down, approaching a base and hearing the sounds of that base compete with the environmental audio. There was lots of wind coming in. An aurora was trying to take off and you see it bobbing in the wind, which was later confirmed to be an effect of the wind actually affecting how stable a ship can stay in place, and then taking off into this cloud front, this storm, and watching lightning strike an aurora and actually destroy it. It was a very, very impressive showcase, and it just made procedural generated planets look like they're going to be visually on par with any modern game that is making smaller, bespoke crafted environments. I was absolutely blown away by this last presentation. Moving on to the next panel, it was called A Social Universe, which is about the new friend system and org management. This was hugely important, even if it's not quite as flashy as the panel from before. My God, will this be a massive quality of life upgrade. They started off by showing the new and improved friends list system, which had a block feature list. It showed locations of your friends, whether or not they were online. You could write notes about people saying like, hey, this was that guy I met during the mission on Microtech. It integrates with Spectrum. It even shows if some of your friends are on Spectrum versus in-game, and you can add favorites to the list. The info here was above and beyond most other friends list systems I've seen. This then evolved into the showcase of the party system, which again shows the locations of party members, but it even sorts them down to the spaceships that they're in and categorizes them. So you can look at a spaceship and see the 5 members that are in that spaceship and what position they're in, whether they're piloting or gunning. It's pretty darn impressive. This then moved on to the new party finding tab, basically looking for group on steroids. It featured a massive list of groups that were available to join, and you could even filter through them by all kinds of options. It would show what contract the party is doing, how many players or ships are in that party, how many they're looking for, their current location, the title of the group, and so on and so forth. An extremely robust looking system. They then showed off the new chat box, which is fully customizable from its size, the font size, the colors used for the font or the background, the opacity, everything you could want to change about it, it seemed like was an option. You'll then be able to add in text links for items, but even locations, which is huge. Just saying, hey, meet me here, and putting the location is going to be like, that's like one of the highlights of the whole freaking show right there. You'll also have tabs for things like a combat log, which is pretty big, a trade channel, and so on and so forth. The panel then moved on to the improvements with FOIP and VOIP. VOIP being voice over IP, which is how you talk to people in game, and FOIP being face over IP, which is the system that's been in the game for a while that has your character's face change and react based on your face in real life, which is tracked with a webcam. The improvements here look so much better. This is actually pretty big. You'll still need a webcam to integrate with the system. I was hoping they would announce that it would work with Tobii as well, but I'm not sure if Tobii Eye Tracker has enough information to make it work. It now works better in low light, according to them, but they didn't really demo that. And the voice comm server for all of this has been completely overhauled to work better, use less data, work with the shard system, so it sounds like a pretty darn big improvement here. The guide system, which has been used for a while in Star Citizen to help onboard new players by having other players help them out and show them around the verse, now has its own tab in game, which is not hidden away in the menus. It's actually a major component of the social tab. You can be a guide or find a guide now in game without having to go on to Spectrum. It has a complete objective and reward economy built into the guide system as well, and it's broken down into just about any category you could want. This looks like a massive improvement for onboarding new players and maybe even making new friends. The beacon system has also seen a complete overhaul to the user interface and abilities. There's now new payment systems where beacons work within the guild system so that the NPC guilds will actually pay the majority of a beacon fee, and players will only pay a fraction of that, making the system far more usable. So you don't have to pay an arm and a leg just to get a ride somewhere. It's now a small fee with your guild handling the rest. It's also been completely overhauled with an incredible looking UI system and new categories. Plus it has a rating system now. It's basically Star Citizen Uber. You can see what the service quality was of a player's last operation and whether or not players like their service. So if you're asking for a rescue or to meet up somewhere and somebody's gotten a bunch of bad ratings, you might not want to pick them. Maybe they're there to try and ambush you. So a self-policing beacon system. This is what players have been saying we need to prevent griefing, and it just seems like, honestly, the perfect solution. We'll have to wait and see, of course, but I was very impressed. Then, of course, there's org management, which is huge. If you're going to have an org of a massive scale, you need to have all kinds of in-game tools. So not only can you now recruit and join an org through the UI that's presented there, but the tools for the rest of the management are massive. Orgs will now have announcement pages telling players of upcoming events and what the latest news is for that org. There's an integrated calendar system, which I assume will come with all kinds of tools for like saying I'm going to be there or I won't be there for upcoming org ops. Allied orgs will also be able to use this calendar system. So if you want to have a giant alliance event, you'll be able to post events that the entire alliance can see. Orgs will now offer alignment bonuses. So if an org allies with a certain guild, you will get bonuses toward that guild. So a mining org could align with the mining guild and then you'll get mining bonuses. You will still be able to join multiple orgs, but you'll have to set one org as your main org, which is where you'll get the bonuses from, but you will be able to switch your main orgs around. There will be a time limit to this. Orgs will also be able to mark other orgs as friendly or ally orgs, but they'll also be able to mark enemy orgs, which will then in-universe mark players of those orgs as hostile to you, or even orange indicating they're hostile of another org that you're allied with. Orgs will of course now offer name tags to your player name in-game, but they'll also offer decals, not only for your in-game player armor, but to go on the sides of your spaceships, which people were very excited about. The next panel was called Dress to Kill, which is about clothing and armor, specializations, and updates. You can now wear clothes under your armor and even over your armor. So if you want to put a jacket over armor, that's kind of cool. You can do that now. Clothes will now have stats. It could even offer modest armor values, but it'll also probably likely give good values to mobility and stealth gameplay. They gave examples for all kinds of armor specializations and bonuses that they give. Armor aimed at pilots gave good EVA capabilities, good G-force protections, it's good for mobility, where heavy combat armor would offer the best protection values but low mobility, no EVA, which means you can't use thrusters to move around in space, decent scans but bad G-force resistance. That said, they didn't want armors to be a super restrictive gameplay factor, so heavy armors can still pilot ships, but they just won't be as effective or offer the same kinds of benefits that a dedicated pilot suit might. And light armor can still fight, of course, you just won't be as effective or have as many damage resistances. They then showed us a diverse party attacking, well, a sandworm, aka the Valakar, which sucks up rocks and spits them at flying targets and ground targets. It can smash ground targets, it is heavily armored, and can only be lured to the surface with ground vehicles, so coordinated efforts will be needed to actually defeat one. This sandworm was located on Pyro, not some distant Lear system, and will allegedly be around in the next 12 to 18 months. After defeating one of these worms, and they did seem quite tanky, you can then harvest special resources from them, so there's a real reason to actually hunt them down, and those resources can be used to sell or craft, and there's tons more info on that later. Worms will come in different sizes. The juvenile sizes will be fought with FPS weapons, and they might show up in cave systems, so miners beware. Killing enough juveniles can also attract adults, which are considerably bigger and freaky looking. Apexes, like the giant one shown in the demo, will move around on the surface of the planet, creating sort of dust storms when they move, so you'll actually be able to track them. The Valakar, aka mega worms, will have different types depending on where you find them. The jungle ones might look more like serpents, where if you find one in a cave, it could look like this creepy bastard right here. We then moved on to the Beyond Pyro panel, which gave us our first look at the Nyx system, which will be the next system after Pyro. It's a small lawless system that borders Vandal space, so we can expect Vandal raiding parties. It has a sprawling black dust cloud that makes sensors less effective and reduces visibility pretty much system-wide. Delamar is back, if you're an old enough player to remember this location, and it's actually an asteroid now instead of a small planetoid. Its integrated base, Levski, looks amazing with a hole bored all the way through the entire asteroid. The hangars are actually integrated into that borehole, and it just looks super cool. Every time they showed it, I was like, I want to go here as soon as possible. The interior was shown off, and it looks pretty similar to the original time we got to see it with some updates, and of course they're keeping the rich history of this location. They then moved on to show off the future missions that we can expect around the verse, which included missions that we can partake in Area 18, which will involve going into the Municipal Works Access area and basically dealing with gangs and combat situations and all kinds of cool looking missions. Many of these missions will take place in instanced locations, which is a big deal. This means no outside interference while you're running a mission solo or with a party. There'll also be multiple levels of difficulty as you increase your reputation with the guilds that offer these missions, allowing you to access deeper areas of these regions and likely fighting bigger bad guys, but also getting bigger rewards. This same concept will be carried out in other landing zones, offering bespoke, cool-looking instanced mission gameplay. They then revealed the fourth system that will be added to the game, Castra. This system has a pretty cool history of being a military staging system on the border of Xi'an space. And since tensions with the Xi'an have more or less de-escalated, it's not really supposed to be a heavy use military base anymore, although it is still massive with giant orbital cannons and, javelin destroyers flying around, so it doesn't look like a pushover or anything like that. This base is called Sherman and it's located on Castra 2. They showed a pretty lengthy video of the pre-production look at this location, and honestly, I don't know what CIG thinks pre-production means because it looked pretty final to me. The planet has an impressive ground layer of clouds and also a higher level cloud layer, creating a really cool looking sort of cloud sandwich and very alien feeling to the space. They then finished off day one with a Squadron 42 prologue. This was a live gameplay demo of Squadron 42's first mission that is more or less an hour long. And we have seen clips of this before, especially at last year, but we haven't seen the full playthrough, and honestly, it was incredible. They also announced that Squadron 42 will feature 30 to 40 hours of gameplay, which confirms rumors from before. And if it keeps up this visual quality and cinematic level throughout those 30 to 40 hours, it could be one of the most richly detailed game experiences, period. The prologue was very heavy in cinematics and a little bit lighter on gameplay, but in my opinion, the camera work, the writing, the acting made it one of the better space battles that I've seen in a video game or film alike. It was incredible. It was like watching your favorite episode of Battlestar Galactica, just truly AAA level graphics and acting and everything. Sadly, because Chris really wanted to push for the prologue to be played live on stage, there were several crashes during the prologue sequence, which really sucked. Allegedly, he really pushed for that because all the times they tested it prior, it worked without a hitch, but I guess they tried it on a different PC for the demo and there were issues. Shortly after this presentation, the team went back to their main offices, recorded the demo on a single playthrough, first try, and uploaded it immediately to YouTube just so that they could show that it wasn't quite as buggy and to give the public a better uncut representation of the gameplay. As the prologue finished, we got hit with a Squadron 42 release date, which was not what anyone was expecting. 2026, no further detail given. This was a huge letdown. There's no other way to put it. The game was announced feature complete and entering a polished phase last year, so I don't think anybody was expecting entering polished phase to mean 3 more years of development. And it was quite difficult to end what otherwise was a pretty impressive day one on such a down note of just a huge delay on what everybody was expecting. Day 2 began on a pretty great panel and honestly maintained excellent momentum the whole way through. Starting off with crafting, which is going to be a major component of the Star Citizen universe. They first kind of define how you gather resources, whether it's through mining, salvaging, hunting animals, or even extracting them directly out of the ground using base building gameplay. You could then trade or sell those resources that you gathered or use them in crafting, which you could then use or sell the items that you craft. Players will need to plug in blueprints to various crafting machines to make specific items. You can find blueprints by looting, you can get them as rewards for things like progressing through your guild reputation or missions, and some of them you can just buy from stores. You can also upgrade blueprints through a research mechanic to improve the item production quality. On top of this, the materials that you use for crafting will also affect the outcome, and you will have different material quality levels. So using a high-end rare material versus a low-grade version of that will give you different results, aka weapons with better rates of fire, reduction to wear and tear on your gear, and all kinds of additional stuff. Even the number of craftable items you can make can be a result of the quality of the materials you use. There was tons of examples of in-depth item stats. It very much reminded me of action RPG RPG or MMO stats, just without, adding lightning damage or something like that. And you'll even be able to craft food items with better materials, which will give you food that has better properties to it, which I thought was kind of cool. Craftable items will have tiers as well, and you'll even be able to upgrade an item from a lower tier to a higher tier. Higher tier items will have stats, and spaceships will have tier levels. In fact, any store-bought spaceship will be Tier 1. And again, you can unlock higher tier blueprints through research mechanics. Vehicles can have up to 5 tiers. Refining will also have its own blueprint system, so getting better refine levels and better outputs will require upgrading and researching those blueprints. To craft items, you will use crafting machines and plug your resources and blueprints into those machines, and there will be different types of those crafting machines for different types of craftables. There will also be different sizes and tiers for these machines. The smaller machines that could, say, make handheld weapons and food items can be kept in hangars, on ships, inside your bases, which of course made me think about really cool ships that can fly around and craft on location. I think that would be pretty dope. There's also going to be over 1,000 blueprints, and players are encouraged to specialize, at least at the start, since learning blueprints and researching is going to be time intensive and require a lot of learning around it. So rather than trying to tackle everything at once, master a specific area while maybe your friend focuses on another area. This, of course, then evolved into talking about base building, giving us our first look at a basic level building of an outpost. More or less your cabin in the woods. The low-level base building is going to be accessible to pretty much all players, with the basic building machine being able to fit in something as small as a cutter. This construction machine uses drones to build. There will be small, medium, large, and extra large versions of drones capable of building different size structures, and the larger the drone, the faster it can build. These construction machines will need resources to build. You can start building something before you have all the resources, but it will stop and need to be resupplied along the way if you don't have them all to begin with, and it can even take supplies from the surrounding areas that you have designated for it to use, which is pretty darn cool. These construction devices will also have survey tools and placement tools. It looks really cool, kind of like an RTS. There will be restricted areas that you can't build on, whether or not it's because it's the side of a steep mountain or because it's a preserved forest area or something like that. There will be certain rules to this, and you'll have to play within those rules. It seems like generally flat ground is going to be more desirable. Buildings and structures will need a power source. The cheapest power source is going to be a fuel generator, but there's also going to be things like solar power and geothermal power as well. Fuel generators will need to be refueled and maintained by replacing capacitors, and I think most of the base is going to need basic maintenance of capacitor replacement and potentially more beyond this. One of the main benefits of having a base is that they can place down extractors, which can be used to extract specific resources from the ground, which will then be used for trade and crafting. The power management overview lets you turn buildings on and off, maybe better manage your power supply and set rules for your base. You can add furniture, of course, into the interior of your buildings, and you can even lock it in place so that other players can't move it around or mess up your layout, or give specific access to, say, org or party members to manage your base for you. Now, the panel didn't stop there with your little cabin in the wood base. They moved on to the industrialized version of bases, basically bigger. This started off with showing a construction hub, which is a giant tower, which looks awesome and gives you a huge high overview of your entire construction area, which is then used in a similar manner as the construction module from before to build bigger areas with special construction options. And allegedly this tower here had to be constructed with a bigger construction vehicle. So I think probably a Pioneer, although they didn't specifically say what was needed. Now, for the sake of the demo, the construction speeds were sped up, but they indicated that larger structures will take much longer to build and tons more resources. So this will be org level gameplay where you're going to need quite a few people working together. The bigger bases can have things like hangars, refineries, water pumps, generators, bigger living quarters, major foundation areas, which would be just like laying a big concrete foundation for smooth driving and storing things easier. Freight elevators. They didn't demo building roads, but there were screenshots and things shown off where it seems like maybe foundation just laid out in specific areas can act like roads. And then you'll also be able to place foundation decals, which will be used to mark landing areas or storage areas and stuff like that. It just looked really cool. Plus, you can even change the color and styling of your base to really give it maybe your org's coloring or just give it your own style. They then discussed the farming and ranching side of base building, where you can build vertical farms to grow produce. There's areas to keep livestock and produce whatever they make for you. And frankly, all of this content looked like it was quite far along. The user interface, the structures, all of it looked really incredible. And of course, players were just foaming at the mouth for this content. Then of course, there'll be base defenses. If you're building in a lawless region, you're going to need turrets and shields to protect your layout from other orgs. And they also wanted to indicate that you're going to want to spread out bases even as orgs. You're not going to want just one central base, but different regions of planets will have different resources. So you might want a mining base in one area, a livestock base in another area, a production facility somewhere else. They seem to indicate that there would be a good reason to have bases in different locations. Now, the next panel was called Captains of Industry, and this was more or less your vehicle showcase. And of course, new vehicles came to the store, which you can buy right now. And at the beginning, they very much tied in the vehicle gameplay to base building gameplay, showing off vehicles that could have construction drones attached to them with the new Argo SRV family. And basically these are construction support vehicles. They're ground vehicles. They have their own drones and own supply versions. The Argo CSV FM has 2 medium construction drones, 4 SEUs of storage, and seems small enough like you could put it on any ship that has a basic hangar in the back. So more or less they're giving upgraded construction capabilities to people who don't have construction dedicated spaceships. There's also the Argo CSVSM, which has 4 SUs of storage, and I'm not entirely sure what the purpose of the vehicle is other than assisting with construction in some way. I gotta say, I'm not totally sold on these little vehicles yet. It was hard to see how they offered major benefits over spaceships with integrated construction drones other than just providing construction means for ships that didn't have it already built in. They then showed off a pretty big ship, the MISC Starlancer, which is basically a huge version of the Freelancer. It has a build variant that comes with some pretty beefy construction drones, which was not on sale yet. It had a TAC variant, which has tons of guns and more combat options on it, and a max variant for increased cargo storage. It looks pretty cool, and it runs from a low 200s to around $300 for the tactical variant. And it's going to be flyable at IAE as far as I know, so you're getting to fly this one next month. They then showed off the Capital Class construction spaceship, the Pioneer. This was a ship that was put on a concept sale long ago, well before they had even figured out how they were going to do planet-side construction. And of course, they had to massively overhaul the design. Previously, it was supposed to turn into like a transformer and turn into like a mobile factory and build a base inside of the ship and then move on. They've redesigned it now so it doesn't really transform as much as it did before, but it's still pretty cool, and of course it got bigger in size. It now has 4 extra large construction drones, and this ship will be needed specifically to build certain structures. It can carry a massive amount of 1,000 SCU of storage. It has its own vehicle construction bay, so it can literally build its own small vehicles, and that includes fighters, maybe even medium fighters. I'm not sure what it's limited to, but it's like a mobile factory that can arm an army if you need to. It also has tons of internal fabrication machines for building armor and weapons and whatever else you could think of. Its landing gear are now resource extraction units, so you can actually land it on resource hotspots and extract the supplies directly from the ground. It is very much marketed as a mobile base. If you don't want to build a base, buy this ship and then you can fly your base around and set it down where you need to. I was pretty darn impressed with this ship. It also seems like it's quite a ways off. The Polaris, which is a massive combat ship designed to carry huge torpedoes and take out other capital class ships, was also shown off. Heavy emphasis on the interior this time around. It looked really incredible, and I think this one might also be flyable at IAE next month, but we'll have to wait and see on that. It's a really cool looking ship, and they've been working on it for quite a while. They then also did that vehicle silhouette tease of what's coming in the next 12 months. There's a whole bunch of stuff there, definitely some clear variants of ships included in there and a bunch of unknowns. It's exciting, but we'll see. They only delivered about half of the ships on the previous tease from last CitizenCon. Now, the final panel on day 2 was about defining what Star Citizen 1.0 will be. This is arguably the most important panel of the whole show, and it was about letting you know what you can expect for the end game and also drawing a line in the sand as to say, this is what we're offering at 1.0. And you now know what to expect, and it looks somewhat attainable. I recommend watching this panel on your own if you really want all the details, but I will break it down as best I can. Now, they had to start off the panel by addressing an important promise that they made long ago. During the early days of funding Star Citizen, they said they were going to deliver 100 different star systems for the launch of the game. However, that was before they offered fully explorable planets, and due to that massive increase in workload per planet, which meant a massive increase in workload per system, they just aren't going to be able to hit 100 systems for launch. However, they explain that because they're offering so much more per planet, the gameplay that they're offering compared to what was on offer before should actually be increased, and that they're going to limit Star Citizen to 5 total solar systems for the 1.0 launch, with more planned after 1.0. And while you might expect players to be somewhat disappointed by this news, I think the reality of a 100 system universe became unreasonable so long ago that nobody was expecting it in the first place. So with that note out of the way, they then defined Star Citizen as being a game for everyone and what that actually means. People who want to have heavy PvP and org wars, players who want to run missions mostly and fight NPCs, but maybe with friends, but not engage heavy in PvP, and then players interested in the non-combat experiences in the game, whether that means doing cargo missions or building a base on a planet and selling and trading your resources. They then went into how guilds are going to be the backbone of all of these gameplay systems and will cater to all these different types of gameplay. For example, the United Resource Workers Guild will cater to industrial professions. Participating in industrial goals and missions will increase your reputation with this guild, which will unlock new missions, blueprints, and other kinds of opportunities within your profession or activities that you participate in. So the guilds will heavily tie into each type of gameplay in the verse, and they also paved a way for players to be somewhat insulated from the other branches of gameplay if they want to be, but then also add in fun risk-reward mechanics for sort of going into areas where you might be exposed to, say, PvP, but you're still trying to follow your industry aspirations. They then detailed some of the other guilds like combat guilds and exploration type guilds, cargo running guilds, all these kinds of guilds that you can kind of align yourself with and run their missions. There was a lot of time spent showcasing how they were going to motivate player intentions using the guild system and crafting system, where they gave an example of something like a Hornet being a military ship. It wasn't going to be for sale in any of the ship shops, but if you were somebody who enjoyed PvP or flying spaceships for combat purposes, you might really want a Hornet, which might lead you down the line of crafting so that you could build your own Hornet with a blueprint, which would then get you into mining for gaining resources to build that. And it was a cool web of how they tied all the professions into each other and giving players reason to sort of dip their toes in other adjacent professions to better improve the one that they were most interested in. Obviously, there's a ton of complex nuance here, so if you want the rest of that info, you'll have to watch the panel. They then talked about how there was going to be a huge focus on a main story-driven experience in the persistent universe. They stressed that the story and the missions around this story would not be mandatory to enjoy the game, and that at any point on your story missions you could bail and just go hang out with friends and do whatever other activities you wanted to, but that this system would be a great introduction for players into the narrative and lore of Star Citizen, while also kind of serving as a guide for giving them a taste of different regions of the universe and different professions. An interesting note of this is that completing your main story quest would then give you citizenship in Star Citizen, and one of the perks of being a citizen is the ability to claim land in specific areas of the verse. It's not to say that you can't claim land otherwise, but you will have restricted access based on your citizenship. And I would imagine that there will be other perks tied into this as well. They then announced that the Terra system will be the 5th system at the launch with Star Citizen 1.0. Terra will also be heavily integrated with the narrative story campaign in the persistent universe, and it's a major system and has also become a major power in commerce, and some of that narrative will revolve around the politics of it competing with, say, the Sol system and grappling for galactic power. We didn't really get much visuals of Terra, but it's going to be a pretty large system with 4 major planets featuring wildly different biomes, from epic jungles to tropical paradises and spiky magma planets. It looks pretty dope. They then moved on to ship insurance, which is actually a pretty important part of the whole presentation. Basically, they talked about ship claim times, and that right now in the verse, 90% of current claim times in Star Citizen are for ships that have not been destroyed, but instead are just players trying to summon a ship to their current location. They're going to try and discourage this type of gameplay by increasing claim times to be more in line with the actual manufacturing times of a ship. So for larger ships, this means claim times would take a very long time, where smaller starter ships would still be pretty darn quick. But they're going to give you retrieval shuttles so that if you need to go retrieve your ship, you'll be able to get there with free shuttles, I believe. This seems to be somewhat similar to a system that Eve uses, where you can have very inexpensive shuttles to get around and move around the verse. It seemed to be a neat solution, but they didn't get too in-depth with everything. They then defined high security and low security a little bit more than they have in the past. High security systems will have very fast response times for somebody performing an illegal activity like attacking another player. However, the high security systems will still have low security areas around the outskirts. So if players want to do bad things out there, it seems like they'll be much more accessible, and that the security systems will escalate in force depending on the level of aggression required, which is already kind of how it works, but due to NPCs generally being somewhat brain dead due to server limitations and whatnot, I would expect this system to evolve significantly post-server meshing. They then went in to talk about the evolution of stealing ships, and there were some caveats in their explanation, which I'm curious about, but basically if your ship is stolen, you'll then be able to mark it as stolen, and you'll then be able to activate a dead switch after a certain period of time, which will more or less turn off that ship and make it unflyable. However, if the player who has stolen that ship has the right skill set, which is going to be a pretty high level skill set, they'll then be able to disable a dead switch and continue using their stolen spaceship. However, it wasn't really explained how this is not going to lead to massive amounts of insurance fraud and ship duping, and I suppose that is a question for some time down the road. So pirates now have a bunch of options when they steal a ship. They'll be able to just salvage it like you could right now. You'll be able to dismantle them at fabrication hangars, which I think will distribute more modules and resources. Or if you deactivate the kill switch on it, you'll then be able to pay for a new deed on that ship and make it your own. Players seem to be very excited by this idea. I have my doubts on its execution, though. I think it has a lot of long-term issues with the ship stealing gameplay, but we'll just have to wait and see. Ship insurance and ship warranty was defined, or loosely defined, I should say. There's still a lot of questions around how it's going to work. Ship insurance will give you credits based on the value of your ship when you lose a ship. So you'll then be able to use those credits to go buy a ship. But if that ship is not for sale in your location or that system, you'll have to buy something else or go somewhere else to buy the ship that you want. Ship warranty will give you a replacement of that ship, with the lowest level warranty just giving you the whole of that ship back, and the highest level warranty giving you that ship back with all of its components potentially and the interior decoration. There's a huge amount of questions around this, and they actually answered a bunch on Spectrum after CitizenCon. So if you bought a ship with cash on the website and it has, say, 6-month insurance on it, you will then have to buy more insurance in-game once that runs out. But that ship will always have its warranty, so once you buy that insurance, you will get it back as the full whole of the ship and not just credits. And apparently all website purchased ships will only have the first level of the system, so if you want the high level that returns all your modules and decorations, you're going to have to pay more for that in-game. They then went into high-level org activities, which would be combat and base raiding, and why the heck do we even want to do this in the first place? They use Pyro as an example, which would be a high-interest system for orgs due to the high resources that are offered on these planets and also the low security there, so they're going to have to basically get those resources, but defend them while they're getting them. Naturally, you're going to want to build bases on the sides of planets to extract those resources, and they're going to become big targets for other orgs or pirates to steal those resources because they take a long time to extract, a lot of money to build those bases. If you're a good enough pirate org, you could jump in there, defeat the defenses, and steal those resources with potentially less effort than was needed to get them in the first place. So to defend your bases, not only can you have walls and weapons that were shown off before, but you can also build shields, which will make them at least temporarily invulnerable. But as far as my understanding goes, these shields will only be accessible to orgs that can assault and maintain control of shield distribution stations and then pay in the most resources to those distribution stations. This system will reset each week, meaning that different orgs can fight for shield resources. I honestly got a little bit confused while they were explaining how this whole system works, and even watching it back, I'm still a little confused on all the fine details of it, but basically the goal is to create a finite resource that orgs are really going to want because it's going to give them a huge protection advantage, and now they will fight week to week for this protection advantage, and it does seem like a really cool system to encourage combat and fighting over resources. This then transitioned into super endgame org activities, which is building space stations, massive space stations. The Pioneer would be needed to build the very first construction platform to then further build these stations out, and they're going to be able to scale to pretty much as big as you want with an org. And they're going to be so big on the interior that they will have driving interior combat with potentially tanks and armored vehicles, and other orgs are going to be encouraged to not just destroy stations outright, but try and board them, steal resources from them, or even take them over. The reason why you might want a station, aside from becoming a major trade hub where ships can dock with it easier and transfer resources around a solar system or the whole galaxy, was that they'll also offer massive construction yards with the ability to build Bengal carriers, ships as big as a giant carrier. So basically, if your org wants the biggest and baddest resources, you're going to have to build them in a major space station, and you're going to have to defend that space station. There was a ton more info here about how stations work and all the different things you can build with them. That said, it does seem so far away that I stopped paying attention to all the nuance quite so closely, because it just seemed like we're 3 to 4 to 5 years out from actually getting to experience this content, but it did seem cool. They then wrapped up the event with Chris thanking the devs and the community and talking about the importance of 1.0 being a defined goal now, a line in the sand, and less of a nebulous idea of what Star Citizen was going to be and more of a concrete, this is what it will be. And to reiterate that Star Citizen is not meant to be a game that is finished at 1.0, but instead a game that continues on for the foreseeable future. Overall, I thought it was an incredible CitizenCon, with potentially the last panel being one of the most important ones for people excited about the future of the persistent universe. The Squadron 42 prologue demo was incredible and really made me want to play the final game of 30 to 40 hours of intense cinematics and combat sequences. But the release date getting pushed back was a major deflationary point of the whole event, unfortunately. I hope you guys enjoyed this recap. There's so much information there. I did my best to get the important stuff out to you guys. Let me know in the comments if there's any other important points that you think we should have mentioned, and I'll put them into a little comment thread. But as always, guys, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to drop me a like, subscribe for more content, and I'll see you next time. This is Level Cap, signing off.